So now, without further ado, tonight I'm very excited to welcome Nora Murphy, celebrating the release of The New Mother. Nora Murphy attended law school in Washington, D.C., then worked as a judicial law clerk before transitioning to private practice. A practicing attorney who writes as much as she can, usually on her phone, Nora resides in Maryland with her husband, 2 sons, and 4 rescue pets. Murphy will be in conversation with Melissa Adelman. Adelman is the author of What the Neighbors Saw, which you can also buy today behind our register. So make sure you get a copy of both. She was born and raised in the Washington, D.C. area, a first-generation American with parents from Haiti and Chile. When she's not traveling the world for her job as an international development economist, her favorite place to be is at home in Northern Virginia. Melissa lives with her husband, 2 energetic little boys, and long-suffering Shih Tzu. So now please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose Nora Murphy and Melissa Adelman.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Should I go ahead and get started? Sorry, we had to find our way through the maze of bookshelves. It is a real pleasure to be here tonight with Nora. So I'm meeting Nora for the first time, but I feel like I already know her because we have the same publisher. And I read her first book, The Favor, which is also excellent, last year when I was working on my book. And I felt like she was just a very cool lady who was a practicing attorney, a mother, living nearby, and also writing really good books. So I'm really excited to actually be here tonight and talk to you, Nora. So Nora, could you maybe start by telling us a little bit about The New Mother and the 2 main characters, Natalie and Paul?
Sure. So thank you so much for coming. Natalie is... she is obviously a new mother. She's a lawyer. She's living in a new house with a new baby. And she gets home from the hospital and she feels completely overwhelmed. Her son is not sleeping at all. And she's just struggling with this change in identity and how much her life has changed since she's become a mom. So she ends up taking some time away from her job, and she meets Paul, who is someone who lives in her neighborhood. He's a stay-at-home dad, and he seems to be like a baby whisperer, and he's very helpful. They develop a friendship, and what Natalie doesn't know is that Paul has his own sort of plan for her, and the question is whether she will be able to understand what's going on before it's too late.
That's great. And I read The New Mother a couple of weeks ago and loved it so much. I tabbed a bunch of lines. As a mother myself, there were so many things in here that I just loved the way you put them. So one question for you, Nora, is, it's obvious that Natalie's not doing well when she comes home. And ultimately, we sort of learn exactly sort of what's wrong. But something that I love about the way you write this is that a lot of what she does, a lot of her self-destructive behaviors, in a way are kind of like the logical extreme of the advice that mothers get and kind of the impossible position that new mothers find themselves in. And so I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about how you wrote it, and then maybe share also, if you wouldn't mind reading a little bit, one of these many tabbed lines that are so good.
Sure. So Natalie is, I think, not terribly unique in a lot of ways. Once it gets into the murder mystery, it's a rather uncommon experience. But other than that, her experience as a new mom, I think, is incredibly common in that she is, someone who is highly ambitious. So she devours baby care books and she studies all the guidelines that she feels like she needs to follow them. If she doesn't, she's a failure. She wants to be a perfect mother, and she has kind of her own idea of what that means. So, like for example, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that the mother nurse the baby for the first year of life. And of course, that recently changed to a recommendation of 2 years. But at the time I wrote the book, it was only 1 year. as difficult enough as that is. But for example, here's a brief passage from the book. The seminal advice, as old as time, handed down and regurgitated like curdled milk spit from a baby's mouth, surviving decades of scientific studies and evolving knowledge of best practices. Sleep while your baby is sleeping. Unless you have to go back to work in 2 weeks. Then pump breast milk when your baby is sleeping and put it in the freezer. This was what the advice should have been. So that's just a little taste of what Natalie's going through, because she instead of trying to be kind to herself and enjoy the time with her new baby, she is really sort of suffering, trying to be perfect, trying to follow all of the rules as they are, and she's going through a lot, which puts her in a very vulnerable position.
Yeah, and I think that line and so many others really just captures that so well. Something else I love about this book is Paul, and we know that he's not a great guy. He's got his ulterior motives, but what I also really love about him is that even as a stay-at-home dad, there's sort of a layer of suspicion over him already just because of that. And the fact that, he's not really working or doing anything. He's got a child in school. And so there's this question around, what is he really doing all day? So I wanted to just ask you if that was something that you thought about too, sort of the fact that, him as that stay-at-home dad figure is kind of naturally not someone that we as a society are sort of fully on board with either yet.
Mm-hmm. I think it's funny that you asked that, because I didn't actually think about that when I was developing the character and writing the book, but I do think that makes him more suspicious naturally, and he certainly stands out in the neighborhood for that reason. There's no one else in the neighborhood who's like him, and there is this question by probably the other neighbors, by also his wife, because resentment has built between them as to what is he doing all day, and not appreciating the things that he's done for his daughter, for their daughter, which can be, I think, somewhat of a common dynamic, but to have it in those roles reversed is maybe not so common. So I do think that it adds to the reader's suspicions of him. And meanwhile, Natalie takes the opposite view of it, because she is like, wow, my husband just went off to work and I'm here, my life has exploded. And so she sort of views Paul as very impressive and selfless. So sort of different views of him. And Melissa, your book is coming out on June 20th, so why don't you tell us a little bit about the book, what the neighbors saw, and the main characters, Alexis and Blair.
Sure. So my book is also sort of suburban drama, domestic suspense, and it's a story about a family who buys a house. They buy a fixer-upper on the best street that they can afford. And the book is basically about how they learn over the following year after buying it, how that probably was the worst decision they could have made. And so I tell it from the point of view of two women. So Alexis is the mother and the wife in the family that buys the house. And she befriends her neighbor across the street, a woman named Blair, after Blair's husband is murdered. And the two women, it really couldn't be more different, sort of superficially. So Alexis is Black, in her 30s. Her children are really young. She's on maternity leave, sort of close to the beginning of the book. For her, this is her first experience sort of living in such a nice place, and it's a real financial struggle to make it all fit together. And Blair is, much older, like at least a decade. She's quite well off. Her background is very much upper class. But it turns out that they have a lot more in common than they realize, for better and for worse. And so that's kind of what the book is about. Yeah.
And where did you come up with the idea? I won't give away the twist, but it came as a shock to me, and I know I read it in one day when I was home with a 2-month-old baby, so that should tell you how much I loved it. But did it surprise you, or did you kind of know all along where you wanted to go with it?
Yeah, the plot line I sort of knew from the beginning, and then filled in the rest. And I will try not to give anything away either. But it is, I think, in one sense, a little bit crazy. But in another sense, I hope that people will read it and be like, oh, actually, like I can see how that could happen. And really, I was looking for something like, odd enough to make it surprising, but still believable in a way, I guess. I guess I won't say more to not give too much away. Yeah. So something else that I wanted to ask you about, given that you are a mom and an attorney, a practicing attorney, is really if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to writing fiction. Like I said at the beginning, The New Mother is your second book. The Favor, which came out a little over a year ago. Mm-hmm. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah. So you've written 2 books in as many years, and so that's very impressive in and of itself. So, how did you come around to writing fiction, given that you already had a very, successful career? And how do you find the time to do it?
Yeah, I think a lot of lawyers turn to fiction because depending on the type of law that you do, it can be not terribly satisfying or fulfilling. And for me, it was what I was practicing at the time I started writing fiction was very emotionally draining for me. So writing a novel was really like my escape. And I started before I had any kids. So I used to write early before I went into work. And then once I had my first son in 2019, I could not do that anymore because he didn't sleep at all. So I started writing on my phone while I was holding him, and it was really learn to write on my phone or give this up. Don't write at all because I remember thinking when I went on maternity leave, like, I'm going to get so much writing done. But then it was like, even if he did happen to go to sleep in his swing or something, it was like as soon as I opened my laptop, he knew, and it just wouldn't happen. So I started writing on my phone, and I still do that. I did it, as I had more time in between my kids and after I had my second son. Especially sitting in a chair holding a baby can be boring, so it's nice to have something to do, reading, writing, and I still do that now, and I like how kind of low pressure it is because you don't feel like you sit down with your laptop. You have to be very productive in that time, so to just pick up my phone for a few minutes here and there's just much less pressure on it.
That's great. That makes me feel bad about what I do when I pick up my phone.
I do those things
too.
Right.
Scroll through Instagram.
Yeah.
It would be really interesting, I think, to hear a little bit more about that process for you. Mm-hmm. So how you get from an idea to a complete draft. I think becoming a writer is sort of opens that door when you talk to people, and I feel like a lot of people have ideas, mm-hmm. But it's obviously very daunting to try to actually make them turn into something. So it'd be interesting to hear kind of what your process is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my process has evolved. Like, The Favor was my first published book, but it was the 8th book that I wrote because I kept trying. But my process now, what I've developed is that I start with like a vague idea, which is probably how every book starts, and something just comes to me. I make a note in my phone, and then if I keep thinking about it, I'll come back to it, and then eventually I create like a chapter by chapter outline from that idea, and it's very specific. They say there are plotters or pantsers, and I'm probably way too much of a plotter, but I like to have everything kind of laid out, and it does change. But then I'll just start writing usually from the beginning, and I write chronologically and then take pauses to go back and read and revise, which is really, I think, the most fun part of the process is kind of taking a break from the writing and going back to read what you've written and make tweaks, and I just kind of work through the book from start to finish in that way.
So plotters or pantsers that you referred to, that's the people who write by the seat of their pants, right? So
Yeah.
just sort of taking your fingers on the keyboard and going for it, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And what about, how did you write What the Neighbors Saw? Are you a plotter or a pantser?
I think somewhere in between. So I think I have a hard time I also sort of need a structure to follow. Like, I think it's very hard for me to just go into it and see where it goes. But I have a hard time doing that on a laptop. So I went to physical note cards and would sort of write ideas for scenes until I got kind of a pile, and then spread them out on the floor and tried to organize them. So yeah, it worked out okay. It was messy and kind of, so I couldn't go back and find those if I ever needed to, but yeah, that's what I did, somewhere in between.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. And something else I wanted to ask you about, Nora. So both of your novels so far, The Favor and The New Mother, are, I think, really smart and incisive social commentary on like really interesting issues. In both cases, I think primarily issues that affect women. So The Favor around domestic violence, and The New Mother around motherhood and kind of the crazy expectations that society puts on new mothers. So I just wanted to ask you a little bit about sort of how you came to those topics, and if that's kind of what you want to keep focusing your writing on.
Yeah, so The Favor was inspired by a research paper that I wrote in law school, and about the clinics that I did in law school about survivors of intimate partner violence who have suffered abuse at the hands of professional abusers, so people with high levels of education and credibility and maybe successful careers, and the unique challenges that they face. And so I wanted to kind of turn that into a novel and make people think about the way that they perceive those survivors, and help understand the unique challenges that they face, like I said. So then with The New Mother, I was kind of thinking about my own experience as a new mother and postpartum mental health issues. And so I thought about how, when I had my first son, I was kind of surrounded by support. I was very lucky, but yet I felt very isolated, and I felt very vulnerable. And I was kind of thinking, how dangerous that can be, and that gave me the idea to turn that into a thriller. Because, what might happen if you have this isolated and vulnerable new mother and someone tries to take advantage of that. And I do think that I like writing fiction, but I like writing about real issues that I'm passionate about. So I think that I'll probably continue in that vein in my third book, which is like painful for me right now, but it's in a similar vein. It's in progress.
Yeah, that was something we were just talking about before coming out here. Sort of the long process to get from ideas to actually finished drafts and to publication. So, sort of how many ideas and drafts have to sort of go by the wayside along the way. So
right. It's not so simple as writing a book, which is maybe the nice thing about being a debut author, is that when you're working on your debut novel, it's really for you, and then it's once you have, which is a privilege to have other people involved, but it's also more people to please and have achieve their approval. So once that comes in, and there's a little more pressure. So yeah, the things we're going through right now. And what the neighbors saw, going back to Blair and Alexis, when Alexis moves into this new neighborhood, she feels a little bit out of place. And I have one of my favorite lines when a new neighbor visits Alexis's new home shortly after she moved in. She tripped herself up trying to be polite while craning her neck to see past me into the foyer in search of a more plausible looking neighbor. So what are kind of the significance of these feelings of Alexis to the plot of the story?
So I think, like I mentioned before, Alexis is a Black woman. She's, in her 30s, which makes her on the younger end of the neighborhood. And it was an area that I thought would be interesting to explore from a sort of, in a sense, it's both her own insecurities and then the reality of what she's experiencing. And I think they come together and make her feel very out of place in the neighborhood and make her suspicious of her neighbors in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. And I just thought that was an interesting thing to explore, is the fact that sort of both things, I think, happen for people a lot. So, psychologically, I think if you've, grown up having these experiences of, what's the right word? Maybe microaggressions in a way is the right word. Then I think that also makes you sort of more attuned to them and more concerned about how you may kind of come off to other people and how other people are perceiving you. And so that interaction I thought was very interesting to explore more, especially in a place like your home and your neighborhood, which is very personal and where you're supposed to feel comfortable. And I think that it helps. I think it's part of the plot in the sense that it kind of heightens all of her senses in a way. And I think, ends up being helpful to her in the end. But I think is a hard and painful kind of way to have to live. Mm-hmm.
It's difficult to talk about thrillers without giving away too much. So need to be careful. And we talked about next books a little bit, but maybe it's too painful for us both at this time. I don't know if you want to talk at all about, is your next book intending to be a thriller, domestic suspense sort of? I think a similar vein. I think, sort of like what you were saying, Nora, sticking to exploring similar issues around identity is something that I'd like to do. So we'll see where it ends up eventually. Mm-hmm. So it's a work in progress. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Cool. Are we good? I think we're good on time. That's I think all that we wanted to discuss, but be happy to answer any questions.
If anyone has questions, we're happy to answer them.
Sure. This is directed to both of you. Did there come a line of demarcation where you decided you were going to sit down and start consciously, purposefully, directly working on it, or was this something that evolved over time?
I think for me, like I said, my first published book was my 8th book, so it was like that really happened to me with my first attempt at writing a book, which was like I kept thinking about the idea and I thought, could I write a book? I don't know. I hadn't really ever thought that I would write a book before, but I do think that just having persistently finding yourself thinking about the idea, and then at that point it's almost like the hardest part is just starting, so to just sit down and start writing chapter 1, which I think you do have to make that conscious decision to just say, I'll give this a try and see what happens, and so I do think that happened with me for my first attempt, certainly. And then once that book went nowhere, it was sort of like a dogged persistence, like that I just kept trying. So, but yeah, I do think that that moment kind of must come because it is a very daunting thing to write a book.
Yeah, I think for me, I gained a lot of courage from that pile of note cards that I made, and it took me months. I mean, I would, the same thing. You sort of have this idea that doesn't go away, and then once I figured out, I read online somewhere that this note card thing would be helpful. So I just started working on that, and then it made me feel like, oh, at least I'm doing something. I haven't actually had to, create a Word file, but yeah, so I just made note cards for months and months, and then finally I had a pile big enough where I felt like, okay, I think I should try to take these and yeah, start chapter 1. Yeah. But it is interesting. Nora and I were also just talking about kind of the experience of writing alone, which I think it usually is that way. But I think it's particularly coming off of the few years of the pandemic and being new authors. I think it's been a particularly isolating time, and so things like this are actually super fun and I think super useful for us to be able to, even something as basic as meeting someone else who's going through the same tough things as you are is really nice. So yeah.
Do either of you belong to writing groups or have some kind of support for writing?
I don't. I probably should and would like to because it's been so nice to talk to Melissa. We just met. But yeah, I think that that's probably a great idea, and that's something I would love to do if I had more time and maybe I could get rid of my day job and focus on this, because I do think that's so valuable to get feedback on what you're writing, especially like we're talking about it being so isolating. And of course you have your agent and your editor, but they are sort of like, they're busy, they have a lot of authors, and it's sort of like you need more eyes on your work than just them.
Yeah, same. I think having started to write in 2020, it was just a time where I think I could have probably tried to find an online community or something, but I think I wasn't in that mental space. And now 3 years later, I also think it's a good idea. Yeah.
What has been the most surprising thing as new authors of the process of publishing a book? Not necessarily the process of writing it, but once you are like talking about agents and editors and getting the book out and doing these events, what has surprised you the most?
For me, it's how slow things move. Like I know that I think it was September of 2020 that we got a publisher for my first book, and then the book came out in May 2022. So it was almost 2 full years. And I remember at the time when we got the offer for the book, I was like, no, that's too far away. I don't, but that's just how it works. It's so far in advance. So it's like, there's a lot of waiting, I think. And I was not at all prepared for that, because you think that there will be so many things to do, getting ready for your book to come out. But in that almost 2-year period, it was very quiet and time moved very slowly.
Yeah, definitely. I'll second that. I think the long process. I think I'm about a year behind you, Nora, and the same thing. Surprised at how long it takes. And I think the other thing is, for me, this is my first foray into a creative kind of industry, and I think just how everything works is very different. So when you're, a creative person, you're putting something out there. There's a whole business obviously around it, but I'm surprised at how sort of removed authors are from the business part. And I think, my background as an economist, I think Nora, probably for you too, as a lawyer, if you're used to things being relatively analytical and facts being kind of at the centerpiece of everything. And so being in a creative space where, taste and feeling are very important, and there is kind of this remove between the creative part and the business part is just very different. So it's been interesting to learn about that too. Anything else?
You marked some passages. Why don't you read your favorite books?
No. Ooh, that's a hard one because I don't know. Here, I just opened one, which Nora referred to. This, I think, actually made me laugh out loud. Okay, so, here, this is a little long, but it's funny. Okay, I didn't admit that there was another obstacle to Tyler's suggestion. We didn't have any formula. My mother-in-law, skeptical of my plan to exclusively breastfeed my son for the first 6 months of his life, had suggested that I buy some formula for the house, just in case. But it was exactly for that reason that I had not. If it was here, it would be tempting. In a fit of sleep-deprived hysteria, I might shove an unsterilized bottle and a box of formula toward Tyler and order him to take over for the night. If we didn't have any formula, I couldn't do that. There was a CVS open 24 hours only 5 minutes away from Ashby Drive. But no, I was only following the recommendations promulgated by the American Academy of Pediatrics. They wouldn't recommend something that was impossible. And if it was possible, that meant I needed to do it. I love that one.
That was like, it actually happened to me, so it's like taking me back. Much of the book is autobiographical, not the murder, but much of it is, so it's like re-traumatizing.
I'm sorry.
No, it's funny.
I know it's right. And I was telling Nora too, is that, it's very, in certain ways it's very dark, and it is a suspense, and there's a murder, and it's a thriller. It's a very dark book. But I think if you've been through the experience of being a new mother and sort of facing these impossible asks in a way, and also I think probably being the kind of person who's used to being able to meet wherever the bar is set. So, if they said, this is where you need to jump, you'll say, all right, I'll jump over that bar. And then you come to this experience where it's like physically, emotionally impossible. It's just so horrible in so many ways that it made me also sort of laugh and cry at the same time of remembering those experiences of like sobbing in Target when I had to go there and buy formula for the first time. So, yes.
Yeah, it's becoming a parent, being a controlling individual and type A individual, becoming a parent is difficult.
Yes.
I mean, it's difficult for everyone, but yeah, they have control.
Yeah, and you capture that so beautifully in so many ways. So, yeah.
How have your families impacted what you've written, Nora for your first two books and Melissa for your book?
I mean, with my family, I guess it's been like their impact has been like their support for me, because it's like I've added this sort of like another job to my life when I already have a job, and taking care of them. So just the support so that I can kind of pursue my dreams. And then on the other hand, for the new mother, it was just like material, because it's like, so the author's note goes into it, but it is very autobiographical in a lot of ways. And my husband hasn't read it yet, and I'm a little bit nervous for him to read it, because the husband in this book is generally, he's not here. I'm like, oh my gosh. He's well-meaning but unhelpful. So I think he will probably see himself when he's planning to read it when we go on vacation next week. So I'm like, we'll all be in the same hotel room, so it should go well.
Oh, you can process it together, right? Yeah. I think same for me. I think it's been a lot of support and positivity. It's like, okay, I want to do this crazy thing. And so it's been very, very valuable to have a supportive family who's willing to, say like, yeah, that's a great idea. So go ahead and, make it work. I think for me, for What the Neighbors Saw, my material really came from my house more than anything else. So buying the experience of buying an old house and thinking like, oh, this is going to be great. Like I've watched so much HGTV and, you know, this is a good investment. Yeah. And sort of how that can turn into, you know, nightmares may be a little excessive, but something close to that. Yeah. Oh, one more.
Were there any particular authors that you could recall relating to when you first started thinking about maybe writing something? Like you're sitting in AP English class, or college English, fourth year electives.
I guess I'll say I read a lot of other authors in the same space. I think in domestic suspense, I think there are a lot of amazing ones. I love like Leanne Moriarty, those types of books that really get into relationships, friendships, families, all kinds of stuff. But I think, growing up, I was a pretty not a particularly discerning, I guess, reader. Like I love all kinds of different books. And it's interesting. I haven't sort of thought through, does my style reflect a particularly beloved author, kind of where I would put myself stylistically? That's something I haven't thought about yet, but it's an interesting one.
I don't know about stylistically, because it's sort of, I think writing is just sort of natural. I feel like everyone kind of has their own, like a speaking voice. It's almost like you have your own voice in your style. But I love Patricia Highsmith, and like my first book was inspired by a little twist on Strangers on a Train. So for me, I usually go back to her, and I find that if I'm writing and I'm stuck, it really helps to read a favorite author, even to reread a book, and that usually kind of jiggles something loose. And to me, reading is the most helpful thing for a writer's block.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming.
Hey, hello. Thank you so much, Nora and Melissa, for joining us today. And thank you, everybody, for being here on this fine Saturday afternoon. Make sure to get your copies of The New Mother at the register. The checkout counter is over there. You can also get a copy of Melissa's book, What the Neighbors Saw, back there. And Nora will be signing at this table here. So if you want to get your copies and get that signed, you can do so. You can start the line here. And yeah, it's a perfect summer read for your book clubs, a nice gift, a nice beach read. So make sure you pick up plenty of copies. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.